Beautiful, centre target.
Okay, now I want to touch base on, carry on with the scopes, but I'd like to touch base on essentially first focal plane and second focal plane, and maybe a tiny bit on reticles. Well, we'll start with reticles to start off with. The reticles I tend to recommend for and use for extreme long range shooting, so shooting out really at the 1500 yards and 3000, 2000 yards, 3000 yards, extreme long range. I tend to use a very clean style reticle. So something that's got nice accurate marks, but it's a very clean style reticle. So essentially there's obviously with different reticles with different holdover points, there's the Horus reticles with lots of dots and bits and pieces over them, which are very good in a tactical sense. They work nice for giving you different holdover points and things like that, which can work in places for sure. The negative, as much as there's a positive for your holdover point, there's a negative through what you can actually see. Now you've got your spotter to see and tell you where to shoot, and so that can largely cover it, but we tend to be, in our form of shooting at least, tend to be sharing the job. So I tend to prefer a clean reticle with very little going on in it. Very simple and clean is how I like it. But that's not a set in stone thing. There is the likes of the Horus reticles, there is lots of reticles will give you other holdover points and can work in different situations to help with that side of things. There's more a preference thing of the way I shoot, the amount I'm thinking about, the amount I'm doing behind the trigger. I don't like the extra clutter. I prefer to have a clean reticle, but that's my choice. But carry on what this is really about, which is first focal plane versus second focal plane. Now, we'll ignore this reticle for this moment. This is just simply an example, and I'm not suggesting this is basically a crude drawing I've done of the MOAR reticle for Night Force, but it doesn't really matter what the reticle is. What does matter is essentially the description I'm about to go through on first focal plane and second focal plane. To start off with, the simple logic of it means that the reticle is either here or it's here. So first is in the forward focal plane, it's also called, it's forward. Second is in the rear. In the first, the reticle changes in size as you zoom in and zoom out. In the second, it doesn't change in size. So we'll go up to some drawings up here, which I've done up to make sense of all this. In a standard form, in about where you shoot this sort of scope, or any sort of scope, around the 15 power, sort of middle of their power range, between a first focal plane and a second focal plane, you really won't see any difference. And if you go over to where I've actually done some little drawings of an example of a 5 to 25 scope in both first focal plane and second focal plane, you'll see that here there is differences all around there. To start off, we start on that same place I just spoke about, your 15 power. So about halfway through your range, you'll see there's really no difference in the reticles. They look about the same. You've got a nice big reticle right across the screen. What I've done on here to try and give some reference is shown an estimation of your target through here. Now, I'm not trying to say the target is everything, whether it's a 6 foot target or a 2 foot target or a 2 meter target or a 6 inch target. It's still going to be in reference to what we're talking about. When you're zoomed in, it's going to be bigger. When you're zoomed out, it's going to be smaller. So some of the points I'd like to raise and some of the reasons that I use a second focal plane scope versus a first focal plane scope are really quite obvious on this little demonstration or this little drawing set on the top here. When you are at 15 power, it's all good. Everything works nice and there's really nothing to talk about it. When you zoom out, you want to zoom back because you want a bigger field of view. You want to be able to see more of what's going on. A lot of hunting people want to do that. You want to see more of the area you're shooting in, so you want a bigger field of view. Then you zoom out, this is what you're actually getting. You're getting essentially these little corners here turn into these big lines, which are essentially, some scopes have nothing here. Most will tend to have these large guidelines, and they are to point you to what becomes a very, very fine reticle. So the negative of this system is that that reticle becomes so fine that in a textured background or in low light or in situations where the condition is perfect, that reticle becomes hard to see. and vice versa when you're zoomed right in. So you're doing 100 yard zero, or you're trying to shoot to 3,000 yards and hit a small target, and you want to zoom right in to 25 power and use your extra power, which you can do. I don't common, but you do it. The opposite happens. It zooms right in, and then it's only the center piece of the reticle, you can see it, and your reticle lines become very thick. So this becomes quite an issue with trying to see trying to target on small things. If you have a small target at extreme range, your reticle lines can be as big as your target. So then you can't see, you have to actually position it to the side because the reticle lines become an issue. So it's if we come back down to the second focal plane, you'll see that the reticle stayed in the same place the whole time. Zoomed right out at 5 power, the reticle size is exactly the same as it was. So it hasn't got finer, hasn't got smaller. 15 power it is in the middle. At full power, reticle hasn't changed. Target's been increased in size, and what it means when you've got a very small target, you've still got a decently small reticle to be able to use. So one of the features I mentioned there is, well, there's a plus and a negative. The negative, which everyone knows by now, is that a second focal plane, you can't trust that the MOA reading is not simply done by, I'm at 5 power, so I use that to work out my MOA. I just do maths and makes it, and it works, so I can then use my reticle to measure it, to range a target. Or to have holdover, I want 1.5 minutes of holdover, and so I can just use my reticle. Well, I can't do that with a second focal plane. With a lot of practice, with understanding exactly where your scope is accurate, yes, you can still do the same things, but it's not anywhere near as easy as a reticle always staying where an MOA or a mil radian is exactly right. So in that score, they don't work as well. So that would also be why, in most cases, for a PRS shooter, a tactical shooter, which is match shooting, and they want very fast, accurate holdovers where they can hold over to a reading rather than one target size or rather than an estimation. They know they want 1.5 minutes of angle or 3 minutes of angle. They can instantly do it in any power with the first focal plane. Not so easy on the second focal plane. The other thing they can do with the first focal plane is ranging, something I do want to touch on. So when I say ranging, actually using the reticle to measure the size of the target and then use a simple calculation to say how far away it is. The truth of that particular conversation, it's not really an ELR conversation. At a 2,000 yard or 2,500 yard estimation using that, you'll find that you're only using, is it 7/8 of one of those increments, or is it 3/4, or is it 13/16, or is it 0.7, or is it 0.8 or 0.85? You can't measure it. You don't have any finer increments there to measure it properly. And so that once you are then working with essentially it's roughly 3/4, that roughly 3/4 you just did gave you a difference of 2,500 yards to 2,700 yards. If you've estimated where you've actually estimated the target is just 50 yards different, which isn't a lot when you're talking 2,000 yards, well, your bullet just lobbed in 50 yards from your target. So it means really you're using other things. In extreme range shooting, ELR shooting, you're using other features. You're using GPS coordinates. You're using, if you're doing it in a tactical sense, you have proper GPS match. You're calling in, you're finding out exactly where this point is. You're looking at things that have accurate measurements if you haven't all measured it in anyway. In the case of a sniper, they will have kill zones. They will have areas where they have already measured exactly where that road is, exactly where that outhouse is, exactly the distance from them, so they already know to within 5 yards, if not within 1 yard, exactly where things are. So to actually extreme range with a scope, it isn't a practical thing through the nature of the scope. So the other advantage that we get in the opposite sense, we've now, with the second focal plane, we haven't got those accurate minute wind calls one side or the other side. So much, you have to work it out, but we're doing it in other forms where we know the size of our target. We can then see where it's landing from the target and then use our target as reference to be able to give ourselves a hold if we need to. We know what the minutes are, we know the size of the target. The big feature is in a second focal plane is being able to zoom back and then give ourselves more holdover. So once you've gone to the extreme, I should say that's one of the differences. Zoom right back at 5 power. My target's very small, but as you'll notice, I've then got all this range of holdover. I can have up to, if you're zoomed right back at long range, by holding down here at this fine little crosshair, so then changing that to my 0 point, I can be getting up in the 50, 60 minutes of holdover elevation, which is a nice feature when you've gone too far. When this shot at 2,000 yards, I'm using holdover. I didn't have to use that much, but I still wanted 30 minutes of holdover. Quite easy to gain by zooming back. When I just did the shots recently with the 7mm Rem mag and the 300 Win mag at 3,000 yards, both those shots were holdover shots where I'm zoomed back and I'm using my scope. Now yes, I could put on adjustable bases. Not a big fan unless you need them. I could, but I didn't need to. I could actually zoom back and use that power. The other side of things is, as said, when you can do it in 0, and that sometimes is if you have an adjustable base and you can then zoom full power in when you're shooting at 4,000 meters, so 4 kilometers, I am zooming in to 25 power to do my shot, and I'm not changing the size of my reticle. So it means I still have a nice fine reticle to be able to use on the target, even on full power. So there is, all that being said, I'm really obviously selling more the point of the second focal plane for ELR shooting, and in my opinion it works better. It does not mean you cannot use a first focal plane to do this job. It's still quite able to do the job. You have a couple of limitations attached to it, but set it up on the right base, set it up on the right cant, use your maximum elevation, then there are some very, very good first focal plane scopes. I would just tend to use them in a tactical rifle or for that sort of shooting, and really for ELR shooting, I'm definitely a fan of the second focal plane scope. So listen, I hope that makes some sense. Once again, these things are not rules, these things are what my preferences are and what I would do for an ELR rifle. And I'll re-qualify what I mean by ELR. I mean extreme long range. So that is past the point which it should have been shot to. So as I've just said, for this rifle, this is a standard power 243. It's in a different stock now, but essentially the barrel and action are standard. 1 in 10 twist, standard power action, shooting a 95 grain bullet. And this one has shot to 2,000 yards. So that is definitely what I'd call ELR, and even when this is shooting to 1,500 yards, we're in that sort of place. We're in the extreme range for what this is. It's lots of fun to do, but these are some of the ingredients that make it doable.
Hit! Beautiful! Center target!